Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to today's webinar, Chain of Responsibility for Supply Chains. And I'm very happy and I'm very pleased to state that we've got really good speakers today. Number one being Kelly McLuckie and Paul Gaynor. So I'm really excited on the topic today. I'm pretty sure it will be really of value for all of us online. I'm just going to go through to the next couple of slides, just to do a bit of an introduction to for today's webinar and ShopCare. So if you can just go to the next slide for me, please, Kelly, that would be nice. So guys, for those who don't know, but the webinar is being recorded. That's mainly for our training purposes, as well as sharing information as much as possible. This webinar will be uploaded to our website, as well as to our YouTube channel, where some or all of our other webinars are located. So if you have missed one, please go over to our YouTube channel and you'll be able to see some of the previous webinars that we've been hosting. Your mics have been muted, guys, so please make use of the chat function and the questions and answer function. And so any questions for myself or for Kelly or Paul, make sure you use that functionality, or any general comments or suggestions, use the chat function for that. I'll be in the background monitoring all of those. So there will be 3 poll questions throughout the webinar today, guys. So please, we'll really appreciate your participation. All poll questions are anonymized, so please feel free to answer them honestly. And just a bit from a ShopCare perspective, guys, we do run a 8-part series on machine safety currently with Brent Sutton. We've already done 2 parts so far. It's been really, really good thus far. And our next session is next week and Tuesday, I believe, the 6th of December. And it's only a 30-minute session on machine safety. So please, if you haven't got your spot yet, go register now. You'll be able to find also part 1 and part 2 on our YouTube channel. Next year, you know, violent and aggressive behavior is a big thing within, well, not just New Zealand, but pretty much globally. But for us, we are really focused on violent and aggressive behavior, and we'll be collaborating with Skills VR on a webinar where it comes with immersive learning and how to de-escalate situations. After a while, we'll do a bit more with Matt Bennett on site traffic management, and we'll continue our machine safety webinars with Brent Sutton. We'll add more as the time goes on. Then next, from a ShopCare perspective, just the next one, please, Kelly. From a resource perspective, just one click, Kelly, thank you.
Yep.
There we go. Just from a resource perspective, guys, on our website, you'll be able to find our critical risk exposure report, where we've done a pretty in-depth review of critical risks within the retail, manufacturing, and supply chain sectors. There's also a couple of hierarchies of controls on there for you to help you as a guide, as well as a comprehensive driver safety guide that we've collaborated with the AA Motoring Company. Lastly, there will be a couple of bow ties are available for you by the end of this week, and we'll add more in the next week or 2 for you to view and use as guides for your organizations. I've already mentioned Skills VR for VAB, but we're also collaborating with them more on a project. And then we do have another project, which I can't really mention about now. I just mentioned it there, but it's with a government organization around violent and aggressive behavior. We're finishing up a site markings project for the regulator, which will be available hopefully by January. So please watch out for that. And manufacturing, Brent Sutton and ShopCare, we both will be hosting together a workshops on the new machine and plant regulations that are coming out in 2023. And lastly, participative ergonomics, basically manual handling, guys. We do have a focused work stream around that area. We'll be focusing on early intervention, injury management, first move, and we'll do a couple of workshops early into 2023 and see how we can impact our sectors when it comes to participative ergonomics. So that in a nutshell is what we are currently focused on in a very short term from a ShopCare perspective. But before I carry on, I would just like to say thank you to Kelly as well as to Paul for coming around today and sharing your vast experience when it comes to, you know, chain of responsibility within the supply chains. I do appreciate it, and I'll just be in the background, guys. I'm handing over now to both those speakers. See ya.
Thanks very much, Wes. I love that introduction, our vast experience, and probably the first slide that I'll flick to is just a bit of introduction of myself and the business that I represent, Success Formula. And I'll be totally upfront and say, you know, we don't have vast experience in chain of responsibility, but we do have, you know, many years of experience in the transport and logistics sector in New Zealand. And one of the reasons that we actually are collaborating with Shop here and having this webinar today is because we don't believe that chain of responsibility is actually well understood in New Zealand at all. It's something that is well embedded now in Australian legislation and operations, and that's why my colleague Paul is joining us today, because he has been there, you know, really on the shop floor or the ground floor from the time that this legislation came into being, and really being part of that whole journey. And we think there's quite a lot that New Zealand businesses and supply chains can really learn from the Australian experience, and the time is right. We are starting to hear things in industry about that, you know, with the introduction of the Road to Zero strategy and with the development of legislation in general, that we're really looking beyond just blaming the driver or blaming the truck operator. We're really starting to look at the system as a whole. Success Formula was actually involved in a research project about 18 months ago, which led to what's being referenced as the McLuckie report. And that was really an attempt to bring the entire transport and logistics system together and understand where were the triggers and where were the potential solutions that were influencing harm in and around vehicles. And that project, in conjunction with government, you know, strategy at the moment, we believe is led to a time really where chain of responsibility is something that we all need to both understand, but also pay attention to, and be able to take that message and share it with others in the supply chain network. As you can see here from my bio, you know, very fairly varied career in transport and logistics, but have been running the Success Formula business since 2009. We really focus in on the people risk relating to culture, managing change, leading people. And in 2019, we were actually acquired by the National Transport Insurer in Australia. Through that relationship, we had the pleasure of starting to work alongside Paul and his team at LSS. And I'm actually going to step back and now hand over to Paul, who's going to share really the context of that COR journey, alongside giving an introduction to himself. Over to you, Paul.
Well, thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Wes. Really appreciate the opportunity to be joining you today. And what I'd like to cover in this presentation is just a bit of background on chain of responsibility in Australia, and then talk about where we see chain of responsibility in New Zealand, and then talk about just any questions that may arise from that. Just by way of background, I started Logistics Safety Solutions in 2007. It was about a year after chain of responsibility, the concept of chain of responsibility, or COR, was introduced to Australian road transport law. And since then, we've been helping our clients, who are mainly consignors, and their supply chain partners, help understand and manage their COR duties. We've now got about 70 supply chains and about 4,000 supply chain parties in our system, confirming that they understand and comply with their duties. And I'll talk a little bit about the system as we go. Just my background, I used to run some of the trucking associations in Australia. I started up and ran what's now called NatRoad. I was a founding director of the Australian Trucking Association, which is the peak association that we set up in Australia in the 80s, way back in the 80s. I also was the founding secretary of the Victorian Livestock Transporters Association. After I left the associations, I became general manager of a sizable long-distance trucking company called Bunker Freight Lines. We had about 120 singles, B-doubles and road trains doing interstate express every night. And I was asked to come in to effectively clean up the backyard, because the owner recognised that compliance was really starting to bite in Australia, and he needed a cultural change to actually bring the company forward. So and really our mantra changed from whatever it takes to get the job done to instead whatever it takes to get the job done safely. And that safely tag at the end of it really was the driver for a whole cultural change within the business. And after I left there, I've been consulting in the industry for some time. And in 2007, my first client as LSS was Foster's, which is now broken into CEB and Treasury Wines, and Foster's asked if I could set up a COR management system for them. And since that time, we've evolved our system called CoR Safe. And in October 2021, my business was purchased by National Transport Insurance, which is the largest insurer of trucking companies in Australia. I think NTI insure about 25,000 trucking companies in Australia, and NTI is also the largest marine insurer in Australia and New Zealand. So it was fantastic. They've got a fantastic history of working with supply chain and trucking companies to minimise risk and maximise safety. So it was a very good fit, and I've been working with NTI and for NTI since that time. Thanks, Kelly. Just next slide. So just a little bit about chain of responsibility, or COR. COR is a concept that has been introduced to a number of areas of law in Australia and New Zealand. And the one that probably people know the most but don't recognise is workplace health and safety is actually a chain of responsibility concept. And what it means is that the responsibility for an activity goes beyond the party that's actually conducting the activity to any other party that has a controlling influence. And in workplace health and safety and in road transport law in Australia and in New Zealand, it is now the responsibility for truck compliance and truck safety goes beyond the truck driver. It goes beyond the operator or the carrier, and it now extends to every party in the supply chain, shares responsibility for the safety and compliance of any truck operating within that supply chain. And importantly, it means that that responsibility is not just if you operate trucks within your business, it also means if you outsource to parties that operate trucks. So if I can give you an example, now in Australia, if one of our clients, such as Nestle, engages a supplier to deliver raw materials, and that supplier engages a carrier to actually deliver the goods, if the load's not restrained properly at the supplier end, it falls off the truck operated by a carrier and kills 3 people, the authorities can now go after the carrier, the supplier, and Nestle as the client and ask what they did to minimise or eradicate the risk of that occurring. And if they can't demonstrate they took reasonable steps to minimise or eradicate that incident from occurring, then all 3 parties could be implicated in that incident. And that's the direct intention of COR, is to make every party collaborate with every other party to minimise or eradicate risks of the activity being conducted.
So Paul, just could I ask a question there? That doesn't mean, does it, that every party has to manage the risk? There's varying responsibility between monitor and manage, isn't there?
Absolutely. The responsibilities or duties vary between the parties. And one of the things our system does is clarifies the duties and how to manage those duties, no matter who you are within the supply chain, whether you're the carrier or operator, whether you're the customer that actually engaged the carrier or engaged the supplier. There are varying levels of duties, but every party does have duties that need to be managed, and they need to demonstrate that they're managing those duties. Otherwise, they could be implicated in the incident. Mm. And in Australia, the original concept was introduced in 2006. In 2018, the authorities ramped up the whole profile here of COR. They aligned all the language between COR and workplace health and safety. They introduced the same penalties of workplace health and safety. So in Australia now, for a serious incident, as if you're a business, the fines went up from $60,000 to $3 million. And for individuals within a business, the fines went up from a maximum $15,000 to up to $300,000 and 5 years jail. So they introduced the concept of a primary duty, which means that you cannot outsource responsibility. You have that responsibility, and the authorities will expect that you're managing that primary duty. And in Australia, the shared responsibility kicks in for commercial vehicles for over 4.5 tonne GVM. That's the kickoff point for commercial licensing, so they aligned it to that. And the shared responsibility now is for axle and gross weights, dimensions, equipment roadworthiness, driver fitness for duty. There's a different definition in New Zealand for that, which I'll come to, load restraint and speeding. So they're the areas of the activities where that shared responsibility now lies. And I've just got some examples of some of the prosecutions in Australia, just to sort of illustrate where these things are going. The photo on the left-hand side is actually a photo of a truck that was loaded at a building site, and it was loaded too high. And when it went into the M3 tunnel, in Sydney, M5 tunnel in Sydney, because it was loaded too high, the load hit the ceiling of the tunnel, and you can see the debris going everywhere. And both the carrier involved and the customer that engaged the carrier were both fined successfully for failing to manage their dimensions responsibilities. And the important point here was the authorities went after successfully not only the carrier, but also the customer that engaged the carrier to pick up waste material from a building site. So both parties were prosecuted successfully, and they had to pay for the damage to the tunnel. The second photo in the middle was where a truck operated by it was a fuel tanker operated by a company called Coots, and Coots were owned by a company called McLuckie, and the truck was going down the hill, the brakes failed, it ran into some cars, rolled over, exploded, the fuel exploded, incinerated some people. It was a very, very terrible and serious accident in Sydney. As a result, the authorities grounded the fleet. They checked it and they found there was systematic under maintenance of brakes within the business. The company was trying to minimise costs to make the profit look good, to float the company. It was a corporate disaster. We estimate it cost the company and its parent company about $300 million in lost contracts, fines and penalties, the grounding of the fleet. Both the CFO and the CEO had to resign. It was a disaster. The photo on the right is in load restraint, and this one was where an importer of timber in Australia imported timber in containers. In this case, the load was less than full within the container, and it wasn't restrained properly. So when it was put on a truck at the Melbourne Wharf, the truck went round a long bend, the load shifted, and the container fell off the truck and landed on that car, killing one occupant and badly injuring another occupant. And the authorities successfully prosecuted not the carrier because it was a sealed container. They prosecuted the importer because the importer failed to make the overseas supplier aware of their responsibilities for load restraint when they loaded the container. And they also prosecuted them for failing to check that there was proper load restraint when the containers were opened in Australia. So the authorities successfully prosecuted the importer of the timber, and also the family of the injured party went after the importer under civil law for damages to the motorist. So it was a big wake-up call that in Australia, if you import containers, you need to make sure the overseas suppliers are aware that they need to restrain the loads within the containers accurately, or to the law in Australia, or the importer can be prosecuted. And in mass management, there was a company engaged by a local council to deliver mulch, and the trucks that they engaged a carrier to actually turn up to their sites. They loaded these trucks and they kept getting caught by the authorities overweight on the road. So the authorities went back to the loading agent and found that they were systematically overloading the vehicles, and fined them $1.2 million for the systematic overloading of those vehicles. So again, they didn't go after the carrier, they went after the customer that was loading the trucks, and they successfully prosecuted them for overloading those vehicles. So these are all examples of where the authorities have gone beyond the carrier to the consignors or the customers and said, you have not managed your risk, and therefore you are implicated in the incidents. Next slide, please, Kelly.
Paul, just before we move on, something that occurred to me, particularly in the example where they failed to do the proactive management, is where in New Zealand and Australia in a period of, labour shortages, which apply to mechanics, apply to drivers, apply to loaders, etc., but also huge operational tempo, and particularly coming into Christmas. It makes me a little fearful that there could be operators out there that, some of these consigners on the call are using, where they are maybe not through bad intentions, but just because of other operational pressures, not keeping up with their maintenance. So I think that was particularly seemed timely to me.
Yeah, look, it was really interesting during COVID. The industry, and I'm sure it was the same in New Zealand, rather than being negatively impacted, the industry was run off its feet. And we're always very concerned about how, whether that would stretch the elastic band of safety. People would cut corners, and it was really interesting that the industry did a brilliant job in Australia, and I'm sure in New Zealand as well. And we found with our clients that they doubled down on their internal expectations of their loading and unloading sites, and they doubled down on the expectations of their carriers and maintained the standard. It was really, really just such a good example of where the culture has changed, where COR and safety matters. It's not something. Back in the days when I was general manager of bunkers in the 90s, people were just starting to stop turning a blind eye to what was going on, and the culture has well and truly shifted. And I think COR, the introduction of COR, making everyone in the supply chain equally accountable, has really changed the culture. And the being rushed off their feet during COVID was a great example of where that standard is now locked in. It was you feel rather proud working with clients who really maintain the standard when it would have been so easy to turn a blind eye. And hopefully over Christmas, every year sort of take a deep breath, and hopefully over Christmas, I'm sure that'll be the same, that the standard will be maintained.
Yeah. Wes, did you want to jump in there?
Yes, just for the first poll question, guys. Launching it right now. So do you have a chain of responsibility system? The answer is either yes or no.
Look, and when we put this question up, team, we thought, being that we felt COR wasn't well understood in New Zealand, and, well, for a variety of factors we'll go into, that it isn't something yet that a lot of New Zealand consigners really look at with the carriers that they use or those that they buy transport from.
I'll give you like 3 more seconds just to answer, and then I'll share the results.
Okay.
And ending the poll right now and sharing the results.
Not a big surprise to me, Paul. I don't know if that was what you were expecting.
Yeah, look, I think, I've been to New Zealand a couple of times now, and one thing we'll talk about is the great intent, but not the systems, at the moment so I'm probably not surprised, and I really appreciate everyone's honesty in actually answering that, because it's I'm not surprised. And it was, look, if we'd done this poll, before 2018, when they introduced the massive fines and aligned it to workplace health and safety, our experience was that it was pretty much the same. That there was, and our other experience was that middle management were trying to get COR managed, but it just wasn't resonating through the businesses, through large corporates at that stage. And it was only when there was a lot of, when the risk was high, in terms of the impact on the business, that we got leadership teams properly engaged, because they suddenly saw fines of $3 million staring them in the face. So, yeah,
fantastic. So COR in New Zealand, Paul, what does that look like?
So COR in New Zealand is a little bit vaguer than in Australia. We had a look at this. We've introduced a New Zealand version of our system. We got some experts to have a look at what the regulatory environment. So the first thing about COR in New Zealand is it's kind of vague references between the Land Transport Act and the Health and Safety at Work Act. I mean, the Health and Safety at Work Act, like in Australia, there's a high level overarching requirement to manage safety within your workplace, whether they're your employees or whether they're contractors. So there's always a health and safety implication, which is a COR implication. But within the Land Transport Act itself, there's only vague references to COR, to varying degrees. But we do think it applies in a technical sense. If the authorities really had a mind to using the regulations, we believe they could apply COR to axle gross weights, dimensions, load restraint, speed management, vehicle standards, roadworthiness, work time hours, which is the same as fatigue management in Australia, and operator licensing. If you go to the next slide, Kelly, what we see is that there is a real common thread to COR in Australia and New Zealand, the activities that need to be managed. And that's why when we saw that commonality, we were pretty clear that we could apply our system not only in Australia and New Zealand with a little bit of tweaking. And really the only activity that is in New Zealand that's not in Australia, I must apologise here. I've actually I should have said that operator licensing is only applied in New Zealand and not Australia. Load restraint is actually applied in Australia and New Zealand. So the only activity that is unique to New Zealand in COR, we do not have operator licensing in Australia. You do have it in New Zealand. So I'll correct that slide. My apologies. What I wanted to really demonstrate here is that in Australia, the law is front and centre, in the the heavy vehicle national law in Australia is front and centre in the law, whereas in New Zealand, you have to really search to find it. So some areas are clear, other areas are very vague. And therefore, for the regulators and enforcement agencies trying to enforce COR in New Zealand, it would be a more difficult path because the clarity of the legal obligation is not as clear.
And Paul, I understand that, with those prosecution examples and the cases we see coming out of the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator in Australia on a regular basis, they really have developed quite a lot more case law as well, which gives, where it is unclear as to what your responsibilities are, that is starting to, to become, give more shape to it, if you like, than what we've had in New Zealand. I mean, we understand that there is an appetite for prosecution, and we recently held meetings in Christchurch, and then two conversations in Christchurch over the last couple of months with industry and representatives from the regulator. And it feels like on all sides, there's a desire for, pursuing prosecution and cleaning up the industry so that good operators, don't get a bad reputation, but also to really get that system thinking into this rather than just focusing in, as we tend to default to do, with the driver at fault, etc. Yeah,
and as I mentioned before, the introduction of COR has resulted in a massive cultural shift. And all of our clients, or 95% of our clients, are not carriers or not operators. They are consignors. They're the customers, and they operate large supply chains. And these people are, from leadership right through to operations, are totally committed to maintaining a standard of safety within their supply chains. And, they're good citizens, but there's no question that the penalty regime and the risk that now is on the board's radars of these corporates has meant that they've invested heavily in making sure there is an adequate COR management system throughout their supply chain. And so with New Zealand, I think it's a bit of carrot and stick. I'm sure there's a great desire, and I was, Kelly, you and I attended a Transport Association conference in Christchurch not long ago. Clearly, a great deal of desire, whether or not that can result in improvements to the regulatory environment. So it's very clear that enable parties to then have that on the radar, as a key risk that needs to be managed. I guess that's the missing link at the moment in New Zealand is just having that clarity, and therefore getting a whole supply chain engagement rather than people thinking it's just an operator problem.
So in the next part of this webinar, Paul, I know we were, we're going to share a little bit more about the CoR Safe system, with the intention that for those of you who have joined today's webinar, we believe you are proactive, you are committed in your organisations to looking at COR and I guess looking ahead to what can you do to both understand your duties, but also to manage them well. So we thought we'd step you through the LSS CoR Safe system to give you an idea of what does that actually mean in practical terms? What would, and we can share some examples and customer stories about that.
Thanks, Kelly. The first thing I want to say about our system is that when I started it, the law in Australia is not prescriptive. It doesn't give you a how-to guide. It simply says that there are responsibilities and duties that need to be managed. And the law basically left it up to the courts and the regulators to decide operationally what they expected to see in place. So it's been an evolving process, just like it was with health and safety when that was introduced. It wasn't introduced in a prescriptive sense. And over time, the standard, or what the definition of best practice has evolved. And that's what's happened in Australia. The definition of best practice has evolved. And also in 2018, the regulator in Australia, the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator, accepted a code of practice which gave some clarity to the expectations of the regulator and therefore the courts in managing COR. So it's been an evolving process and our systems evolve with it. But what hasn't changed is that there are two overarching principles or goals that we seek to achieve through our system. The first is that we need to make sure that all parties in a supply chain understand their duties for managing COR. And the second thing is that we need to be regularly checking that parties are properly managing their duties. So the two helicopter goals are, can we demonstrate that in our client supply chain that everyone understands their duties? And secondly, are we regularly checking that parties are properly managing their duties? And when we engage with a client, we're engaging at different levels. As our diagram explained, we engage with our client's head office because there are executive duties that need to be managed. And we also need to engage with all of their upstream domestic and international suppliers so that we don't have a situation like that timber importer. We need to make sure that all of our clients' overseas suppliers understand that they have duties that they need to manage when they're loading containers, and also for domestic suppliers, not just for load restraint, but for axle and gross weights and other elements. We also need to engage with all the loading and unloading sites throughout our client supply chain, whether they're loading and unloading sites operated internally or via 3PLs or external warehouses. And we also need to engage with all the carriers or operators that our clients engage directly, because our clients need to make sure that all of these parties understand their duties and are managing those duties. So that's what our system seeks to achieve at a very high level. And in the next diagram, the next slide, I think we've broken it down. Sorry, these are our clients. Sorry, I should explain. There's a few more than that, but these are some of the supply chains in Australia that we work with to implement CoR Safe throughout their supply chains. So amongst those 70 odd clients, and there are clients in Australia, there are also some clients that have now tipped CoR Safe into their New Zealand environment. So Bunzl, Tip Top Bakeries and Transport Works have all switched on CoR Safe for their New Zealand operations as well as their Australian operations. And all we've had to do to make our system ready for New Zealand is add a section to operator licensing, and we can pretty much use the same approach, the same definition of duties, the same way of managing those duties. We can apply what we've learned in Australia to New Zealand because the requirements are pretty much the same. So that's an example of the sort of supply chains that we're involved with. And this is how the system has evolved. This, in essence, is a summary of our system. On the left-hand side, over time, since 2007, we've learnt that there are 5 steps that need to be managed for a COR management system. The first, as I mentioned, is making sure that there's a clear understanding of all the duties that need to be managed. And what we've done there is that we've written what we call a CoR Safe guide, and it's a checklist of duties. Doesn't matter who you are within a supply chain, the checklist will let you know what the duties are that need to be managed. And we've identified 5 different functions within a supply chain. Whether you're a carrier or whether you're a consigner or consignee, everyone has executive head office duties. If you operate a site that loads and unloads, there are distinct duties that need to be managed for loading and unloading. If you outsource to a third party, whether it's an operator or a supplier or anyone else, there are duties for outsourcing. And finally, if you operate your own transport equipment, there are duties for managing those. So we've identified for each of those 5 functions what the duties are that need to be managed, and we distribute that guide to every party in our client's supply chain. So we've got some clients that have got up to 500 parties in their supply chains, and through our online platform, we can release a clarity of duties to all the parties in a supply chain. So we can tick off on that first requirement that every party knows what their duties are. The second step is that we can then, with our client, and again, if I can use Nestle or Tip Top Bakeries as an example, what we do is then identify the duties that they manage internally, and we help them write up process manuals which define each of the duties and how they're going to manage those duties and who's accountable internally for managing those duties. And they're really the glue that bind everything together. If the authorities wanted to come and have a look at our client's COR management system, we would produce these manuals that actually say, here are the duties, here are how they're going to be managed, and here's who's accountable. And that then is the Bible or the how-to guide that we feed out to our clients' internal business units to understand not only what needs to be managed, but how they're going to manage it. Once we've finalised and implemented those manuals, we then turn our eye in step 3 into making sure that our clients' personnel are properly trained. We built an online learning management system. We built role-specific COR awareness training programs. There's versions for leadership, procurement, sales account management, site teams, employee drivers, and load planners and schedulers. We've got about 14,000 of our clients' personnel doing our online training through our learning management system. And that way our clients can demonstrate that their personnel understand what COR is, understand what that means for their roles within the business. And that will help our clients if they're ever tested on whether their workforce are aware. And we also train our clients' personnel on the processes in the manuals that we've written up on how to apply those processes. So there's a big focus on training throughout our clients' supply chains. Once we've done the training, we've implemented the manuals, then the next step is to check the parties are managing in step 4, they're managing their duties, and we have a range of ways we check on compliance. The first one is that we train our clients' site personnel to keep their eyes and ears open, just like safety, to maintain a watching brief and to report and act if they see something. Every site that loads and unloads has to formally inspect a reasonable percentage of inbound and outbound loads and record those inspections. And we've written a mobile app to enable our clients' site personnel to record those inspections and escalate them if there's a problem. We also get every party in a client's supply chain to do an online self-audit so that they self-rate the degree to which they're managing each of their duties depending on their functions, and their clients have visibility to those scores. And the idea is that if you're an operator, you might do the self-audit via our online platform. You might get a score of 60%. You can download a gap report. You can chip away at those gaps to eventually confirm that you're at 100%. And that means that for that operator, they now know that they are reaching a level of management of COR, and our clients can see that their operators or suppliers have done the self-audit, have confirmed that they're at 100%. And then on top of that, each of our clients also goes out and externally audits with one of our auditors. They externally audit a sample of their supply chain as well as to make sure they are what they say they are. We're not the only ones that do external audits. We recognise that. So we actually recognise non-LSS audits on our system, so long as those audits are quality audits by a quality auditor. So if there's a few auditors that we know are good auditors in Australia, if a carrier has used one of those auditors instead of us, and they can produce evidence of that, then we'll recognise that on our system so that our clients can see that their carriers have been audited by a quality audit, and they can download the audit report. We're certainly not trying to double up or reinvent the wheel there. And finally, step 5 is that once we've identified any gaps, we make sure that our clients are making sure that those gaps are closed off. And we also make sure that there are KPIs going up to our clients' leadership teams, because one thing about the 2018 reforms in Australia is that leadership teams need to be seen to be overseeing the performance of their COR management system, just like with safety KPIs. And next to that, Kelly, with your involvement, is that we've now introduced a cultural overlay to make sure it's all very well to have steps 1 to 5 covered, but if we haven't got the right culture ready to grab and run with this program, then it will fail. So a big part of that now is making sure that the culture is there to make sure that management of COR is not just a one-off event, it's an ongoing discipline. So that's our system, and that's what our clients have signed up to. We've got about 470 supply chains and about 4,000 of their supply chain partners actively engaged with parts of this system.
Paul, I think one of the great things about sharing our system in summary is that in the operators that I work with in New Zealand, we have some serious gaps. Very few have load restraint guidelines, very few are inspecting loads. You know, so when I think of the risk that actually poses to both the carrier and the consignors, I think it's quite immense. And so if we do, and when we do go down the path of COR starting to actually be actively enforced, I think it's going to be a bit of a wake-up call in New Zealand. You know, and perhaps before I go on, I've got a couple of questions for you, Paul, around tips for those on the call about where to get started based on your experience. But I think, Wes, you had a second poll you were going to pop up.
Yep, guys. Sorry, there's a quick poll question coming up. I'm launching it in now.
Thank you.
It's a multi-answer question, guys. So what are the factors that hold you back from implementing the chain of responsibility system? Is it budget or resource, not identified as a high enough priority, lack of knowledge, lack of regulatory focus and consequence? Select all that is relevant.
Wow. We're seeing it as it's going, and it's fantastic to get those honest responses. I really do thank everyone for recognising that we can't see the individual results, of course, just the collective trends, but that's really interesting.
Yeah, and probably challenges some of my assumptions as well, Paul. You know, that lack of regulatory focus or consequence, I thought would be the highest. You know, I thought, are we not taking this seriously because the stick isn't being wielded with enough weight? But yeah, as you'll see when we pop those answers up, it's a bit more across the board.
Interesting.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. That's really quite enlightening. I thought the first poll was really interesting as well. So this is great.
So can we just share those results? Yeah, so you know, the fact that lack of knowledge is just as high as lack of regulatory focus and awareness kind of reinforces why we were doing today's webinar, Paul, which was let's share the message a bit wider about what is COR, why is it important, and raising people's awareness of the risk.
Yeah, can I just say with this, you know, it's this reflects when we get a new client. They are doing what they only know that they should be doing. You know, it's one of these things where you only know what you know. And one of the first things we always do is what we call a process review. So we go in there and we say, look, here's the list of duties that need to be managed. Tell us how you're managing those duties. And we sort of can see for each duty whether it's being really well managed or whether it needs improvement or whether it needs first aid. And a lot of this is, we very rarely find that we need to start from zero. There's always been a lot of good work done. And what we often do is really just providing a top-down overlay to the bottom-up work that's really been done. And a lot of it's about formalising the informals. So, people are very experienced. We know that. They've done a lot of good things, and they're looking for clarity. Is that enough? Or is there more that we should be aware of? And so what we can do is give them clarity on what the total sum looks like. And then we can give them some assurance about you're actually doing a great job in the field. It may not be backed by a documented process, and it needs to be, but you're actually doing good stuff in the field. We just need to document, how you're doing it so that we can demonstrate it's happening by design and not by accident. Or it could be that you just need improvement, or it could be that there are some big gaps. And normally we find that the two biggest areas that need a bit of work are management of actual and gross weights. A lot of companies are not bad at gross weights, but when it comes down to actual weights, they're really caught. There's a big gap there. And managing transit times and how they manage trip times is another one. So yeah, I just want to give some comfort that it's never a ground zero. There's always a lot of good work. A lot of it is about formalising the informal and then working through some of the harder stuff so that they can develop those manuals and implement those manuals, having the confidence of knowing that that's going to hopefully get them through an investigation or a scrutiny if it's ever put up. Yeah.
And that probably leads me to the next question that I was going to ask Paul, which is about, where to start. For those on the call that are new on their COR journey, and I guess considering the where to from here, having been on this journey yourself with Bunzl Freight Lines and seen many other customers, what do you think is the first sort of point for people to start with?
Yeah, look, we always start with two things. One is the awareness training of the personnel. Remember, there's two levels of training. There's general awareness training, and then there's training on the processes. So we always start with that awareness training, very broad net throughout the organisation, getting everyone signed up to the online training from leadership teams through to site teams, everyone in the business. So there's that awareness. And the second thing is the process review and writing up the manuals so that we lock in what the total sum of what needs to be managed is. We lock that in rather than people hoping that they're doing the right thing. We can give them assurance through the writing of these manuals that they are doing the right thing, and here's the how-to guide. So they're the first two things. And then secondly, then we engage with their supply chains through the online, what we call our online register, and we reach out to them and get them to do the self-audit so that suppliers, carriers and others can be aware of their duties and confirm the degree to which they're managing those duties. But absolutely, the process review is the key and the training is the key to get started.
But probably one thing I would add from a people and culture point of view is that awareness training at the senior levels is probably a good place to start, because you need the will of the organisation behind you to be able to make, and the desire of the organisation to change. We've seen, and I know you've shared with me before, some organisations where certain managers have great intent and they're really passionate about doing the right thing and getting their people home safe, but where the senior leadership has not provided the resources or the budget or the authority, or made it a priority for their organisation, just like we saw in the safety journey that we've been through of the 90s and 2000s, be the same thing for COR.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, and prior to the 2018 reforms, when the penalties got on everyone's radar, we found that middle management of consignors, like for example, the transport manager, would be heavily engaged with us, but leadership teams in those organisations weren't that engaged, or safety teams weren't that engaged either. After the 2018 reforms, when it became very big on the radar screen of the corporates, they put a lot more weight behind it. At a leadership team, they were a lot more interested in making sure it's being properly managed. They put a lot more resource and budget behind it. So absolutely, when we talk about starting off with the process reviews and the manuals and the training, absolutely getting the leadership team to understand the risk and how to manage that risk is critical, because they'll then put the weight behind the program.
And I would say if you're struggling to communicate that in your role to that executive leadership team, don't be afraid to bring in a lawyer, or, we can offline make a few suggestions of people in New Zealand who are experts in the space, engage with your transport association, look around in the industry for someone where unfortunately something bad has happened that can talk to that experience. I'm not always saying that it needs to be shock and awe, but there's certainly, if you're struggling to communicate or influence in your organisation, don't be afraid to reach out to others and bring those external parties in. We've found that's been really, really successful with the other customers that we've worked with as well.
Yeah. And just in summary, Kelly and Wes, I guess the key points that I wanted to say was that in Australia, it's maturing. It's a fairly mature system now, and the expectations are pretty clear. There's probably, logic would say that there's going to be a similarity between the expectations in Australia and the expectations in New Zealand, the duties that need to be managed, how they need to be managed. We're bringing all of that knowledge from Australia into New Zealand, as I mentioned, with the 3 clients that have already set up in New Zealand, and the other clients that are now looking at it because they want their New Zealand counterparts to be at the same standard. It'll be interesting to see. There's a lot of goodwill and a lot of intent in New Zealand amongst the associations, regulators, police. It'd be interesting to see what that means in terms of the regulatory environment, and whether that can be clearer in terms of a supply chain engagement rather than just an operator engagement. And that'll be interesting to see if that desire can be translate into outcomes. And we're obviously very much part of that equation because we're already engaged. So we're a stakeholder in that process, and very happily involved with New Zealand. It's been great.
Thank you. Wes, I'm not sure if we've had any questions come through, but look, for those on the call, if there are any questions you'd like to ask of us, I think now's probably the time.
Yeah, totally agree. Guys, please pop in your questions, and I will launch the last poll for you. So we'll appreciate your participation in this one as well. Has this webinar been of value to you and to do things differently? The answers are either yes, I found it of value and we'll do things differently. Yes, it's great to obtain confirmation, or no, I basically know it all. So thank you for participating in the poll. We really appreciate that. Any questions, please ask now. That will be brilliant. But I would like to say, guys, the webinar has been really, really informative. So it seems like you have answered quite a lot of questions people have asked, had already with them. So you did your job really well, to be honest.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's great to have that chat.
Guys, I can open up the lines and to see if anybody wants to ask a live question. I'll open the line now, and we'll give it about a minute or two before we sign off today. You'll see both Paul and Kelly's contact details there, my contact details there, Shopcare's contact details there, guys. Please, if you want to revisit this webinar, please don't hesitate to go over to our YouTube channel, as mentioned, and to go have a go at it. And please reach out to us if you've got any other questions. But the lines are open now. If anybody wants to ask a live question, just take yourself off mute and ask the question. We'll give about a minute or so, and then before we sign off. Great.
I must have nailed it, Paul.
I think so too. I think you guys did a brilliant job. Even I was thinking about myself, I'm pretty sure I've got a question somewhere around here, but I just can't think of it. You guys did a really good job. Well presented.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, guys, that's basically it for today. Thank you very much for coming along today. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Paul, for your time. I know you guys are really busy, and I also thank you, the participants, for coming along. I know you're busy as well for this time of the year. Retail and supply chain is going crazy, so we do appreciate every single minute you can spare and coming across and learning from those experts out there. Well, hopefully I'll see you next time, guys, with the next webinar. Until I see you guys again, have a good one and stay safe, drive safe. And Paul, Kelly, thank you again.
Thanks, Wes.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, team.
See you guys.
Bye now.
Thank you.